We had a problem with extraordinary ventures. They again booked to organize us and another organization here at the same time. So shoot them off. I mean, they can, as Chris pointed out, that they could use the downstairs. They don't need these. Anyway, welcome to the Ethical Humanist Society of the Triangle. Thank you for coming out to our meeting today. I am EHST, the president of the Board of Trustees of the Ethical Humanist Society of the Triangle. The Ethical Humanist Society of the Triangle promotes the use of reason and science in the search for and commitment to living an ethical life that benefits all of humanity. We believe that personal inquiry, responsibility, and accountability are the best basis for ethical decision-making. Our weekly forums seek to broaden our understanding of ethics and human nature, and our congregational community encourages us to share diverse opinions, friendship, and camaraderie. We welcome everyone to share the journey with us. If you would like to have get some information on our organization, please let me or Chris sitting here is the cameraman, and Dorothy or Jan. Please let one of us know, and then we will be happy to provide you with more information, and also put you on our mailing list for future programs. We are a community, and so we take time to share joys and concerns. So, joys and concerns? Yes. You want to?
I'm sorry to say that it's mostly concerns.
Yes.
Video pain. It's just sometimes it's in my back. Sometimes, like today, it's in my backside, hip. So if I seem a little bit down, a little bit something to understand. Also, I am seriously considering selling my house and moving into a retirement, either Zeta Estates here in Chapel Hill or their sister house up in Massachusetts. So,
Yeah, good. Good idea.
That's good.
Your talk, the big problem is to get rid of all the junk in my house.
Estate sale. Have an estate sale.
Thank you. Well, around whatever decision, whenever you make a decision, please keep us informed of it. Now you have a few words from Dorothy.
Dorothy didn't put it on our calendar, so we do not have open words from Dorothy. Apologies.
Okay. Well, Jan usually put for an impromptu group after they are. Okay.
Well,
Yes.
this isn't an opening word. I was going to say it during joy and concerns, but I'll use it as my opening words. Sorry. So people who are on Zoom, I have opening and closing words, but I neglected to put them on my calendar, so I don't have any. But I did attend, as did Fred and Mara, I know, the 11 o'clock Philadelphia Ethical Society meeting, which was you, Taft Morales, talking about advocating for a culture of peace, which reinforces a resolution which was made at our assembly this year, and specifically to support House Bill 1111, which recommends creating a federal cabinet post of a department for peace. And that's probably not ever going to go anywhere, but it's a really interesting thought, and we should all think about writing our congressman, and I don't think it'd be negative, but well, that's it is right now. But it was an excellent session. It was recorded, so you can go out to the Philadelphia Ethical Society website and see Hugh's speech. And just because I'm kind of a history buff, one of the interesting things is that Hugh's, I had it wrong in the announcement this week, Hugh's grandfather was President William Howard Taft, and he was the secretary for the Department of War under President Teddy Roosevelt. His great-grandfather was Alonzo Taft. He was head of the Department of War under President Grant. So you kind of weave this in to his talk, but very interesting talk. And I didn't mean to poo-poo the House bill. We all should write our congressman and support that bill because he has some really good statistics. The Department of State, where you might think some of these peacekeeping things would happen, is way smaller than the Department of Defense, and it also isn't really a peacekeeping entity. So anyway, I'll open with those remarks. So can't the others.
Thank you. I do not know that about you. Yes.
The action,
Sorry, I can't find the second.
the action that the American Ethical Union as an action committee is asking us for to get this out of committee and to also get more Congress people to sponsor the bill. So they're not even thinking of getting the bill voted on yet. They would want to move it along. So that is what you could emphasize if you called or wrote a letter. And I don't know whether Congressman Price, I don't think our representative in Durham and Chapel Hill, I don't think he's a sponsor, but look up and see what he is or not.
Okay. Well then, that was actually a pretty good opening first.
Thank you.
Well, today's program, this afternoon, we have Dr. Kim Allen from USC, and she is going to enlighten us on the environmental justice, what you should know. And I'll pass the mic on to John. Yeah.
Well, we're very happy and fortunate to have Dr. Kim Allen back with us again. And just to remind you, Kim has more than 20 years of leadership experience in education, community engagement, and nonprofit management in organizations such as UNC Chapel Hill, the NAACP, and the Martin Luther King Jr. History and Public Policy Center, where she served as executive director. Kim heads up the Keenan Institute of Private Enterprise Signature Scholarship Program, which provides a world-class transformative scholarship experience for undergraduate and graduate students of the Keenan Flagler Business School. She came to the Institute from UNC's Carolina Center for Public Service. Kim holds a doctorate in cultural anthropology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a Bachelor of Science in Education and Social Policy from Northwestern University. So today, Kim will be talking to us about climate justice, and I know we're all looking forward to hearing from her. So Kim, it's all yours. We'll just get set up here. There we go.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon. Good to see you.
Good to see you. You can see the bottom half of my face. It doesn't show in public very often. So I'm not altogether sure what I look like nowadays. But it's good to be here this afternoon. And in response to your share, Dorothy, hopefully by the end of the talk, we can be encouraged to take actions, however they may appear to be futile or not. Just think about the time when we were first talking about Space Force. What does that mean? No one knew what it meant. Oh, the Air Force takes care of that. I said, but now we're closer to a division or department or unit that's specifically for space. And so putting these little seeds out there can grow. It's not guaranteed, but it's actions like we take, that increase the likelihood that change will happen. So let's all be encouraged. So I want to talk this afternoon, not so much about climate justice. There's been a refocus, when you're putting together a presentation, oftentimes your mind changes when you're thinking through something. And so I thought before we got to climate justice, as it relates to principally, I'm thinking African-American and communities of color, we first need to think about environmental justice, because environmental justice preceded talk about climate justice and public housing. And so eventually at the end, perhaps we can begin to put together environmental justice and climate justice, and how does that make sense? When did that begin to make sense? And that kind of thing. So I want to go back and talk a bit about the origins of the environmental justice movement, which some of you, many of you probably already know some of the origin story. Can I get a show of hands? A couple? Yeah. So let's all learn and be reminded together. I first started, so this is where we're going to go in the presentation, a quick agenda. Hopefully I won't end up talking, I won't talk 45 minutes for 45 minutes. But I'm going to tell you a bit about my interest in the environment, where that started back in the early 90s, actually, for me. Talking about when, where, and why the environmental justice movement developed. Making that connection between environmental justice and climate justice. And then also with that, thinking about, as we talk, think about how and why did environmental justice as a movement is distinct from the civil rights movement, which also concerns itself with, principally came out of the history of Black liberation struggle. So why are there two separate movements? And why didn't some of this concern about the environment and issues like climate justice and public housing, why is that not connected to the civil rights movement? But instead, connections are being made with climate justice. So how does that kind of thing happen? And this is a website from the NAACP. This is, so now the NAACP is taking up issues of environmental and climate justice. In the 90s, when the environmental justice movement was forming, I went to the website, nothing about environmental, nothing. But now it's very prominent. And I'll tell you that in my interest, in my story about how I came to this issue, I'll tell you a bit about the work that I did to try to find who in the Black community is dealing with environmental issues. So my interest in the movement. So my interest in the movement. So I'm in my 50s on the upside of that. So I'm no spring chicken. I've been around a while, lived around the country. And I first started thinking about environmental issues when I was living in Ithaca and Roanoke, Virginia, and then Ithaca, New York. And both those places are along the Appalachian Trail. And so I got into hiking when I was living in Roanoke. And I would notice when I was on the trails, and this was in, let's see, in 1989, 1990, early 1990s. I was out there on the trails, And I would notice that there weren't many other African Americans out there on the trail. And even today, if you're on the trails, you won't see very many African Americans or Black people. Well, I don't know about other people of color, but it predominantly, at least at the time, there were mainly white folks out there on the trail. And then as I moved to Ithaca, I started doing trail cleanups after storms. And again, I noticed where are the other people of color? And part of the concern for me around where other people of color is, I wanted a community of people like myself. And I didn't find people like myself, at least who were people of color, other people who were environmentally interested, but no other people of color out there on the trails. And so it got me to wondering, like, really, like, why not? Why aren't many more of us out here cleaning up or enjoying the trails? It's fun. And so I said, well, surely we must care about the environment. We must have some kind of relationship with the earth and nature, particularly given our agrarian history. So much connection with the earth. And I thought, well, you know, among Native American ethos, there's the idea of Mother Earth. And there's a relationship with Mother Earth. And so it got me to wondering, is there something like that for African Americans, something that indicates what that relationship is or something like that? So that's the question that actually took me into graduate school. Because I wanted to find the meanings that African Americans associated with the earth and the environment. And for me, cultural anthropology is the place where you go to when you want to find out what groups of people make meaning of, what meanings they have, cultural meanings. And so I took with me to graduate school that interest in African Americans in the environment and the environment. And so then that took me to the books. So I went to the books. I went from the trails to the books. And when I went to the books, I'm looking for the literature that talks about what that is. And to my delight, I found the African Americans in the environment. But it was in a niche place within the environment, within the environmental movement. And it was called the environmental justice movement. So within the broader environmental movement and all the different kinds of things that happen in the environment, right? From trail cleanups and outdoor activity and protecting the spotted owl and saving the whale. Well, over here, in this corner of it or so, there are a bunch of African Americans, very active, but they weren't working on saving the owl or hiking in on the trails. What they were doing was they said they were protecting themselves from the environment. They weren't protecting the environment. They were protecting themselves from it. And I found that fascinating. And it was being talked about as a movement. And then I found out that movement started in North Carolina, right here where I am at Chapel Hill. And so now I was outdoors on the trail, came back indoors in the books. Now I needed to go back out and find these people out here, these Black people out here who were working on the environment, working with the environment. And so I set about looking, and I couldn't find them. Again, I couldn't find them. I thought, well, surely there's a directory of these groups. Surely there's where are they? And I had to investigate and find and piecemeal. Oh, there's one over here, there's one over here, there's one over here. And so that's what was beginning to happen. And let's see. So what I found was, as I was looking about were folks in Warren County. How many of you have heard of Warren County, North Carolina? Warren County is north, right at the border with Virginia, towards the eastern part of the state. I have a map. I'm going to show you that. And so in North Carolina, Warren County. So what I'm going to do from this point on is I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Warren County story, where that moved as the spark of the movement happened. I'm going to share some national developments that supported this spark, that like put some gasoline on the flame. And then how North Carolina has played a pivotal role in it becoming a national and now an international movement. So it had its beginnings in North Carolina. It got national and international, but North Carolina continues to play a pivotal role in its development. And I'll talk about how. Go back. So this is okay. Before I get into the particulars of the Warren County story, and this is for other movements and other developments that are currently happening, to think about them, to think about social movements as sites of cultural production. Again, I'm an anthropologist, not a historian or sociologist, so I'm always interested in how people make meaning. And when people get together in movements, they produce stuff. We call them cultural artifacts. Songs, symbols, ideas, slogans, stories, brochures, websites, art, images. All these things are produced collectively in social movements. If you think about Black Lives Matter movement, all of these kinds of things are being produced. The yard signs, the hats with the slogans, all of this stuff it wasn't there before the movement, but it gets produced in the context of people coming together in collective action. So social movements are very productive in that way. And they're also very productive in terms of producing identities, how people re-identify or identify themselves. I'm a Black Lives Matter activist. I'm an environmental activist. I'm an environmental justice activist. Well, you don't just wake up one day and declare, I'm an environmentalist. It doesn't happen overnight. You come to re-understand yourself and the actions that you take. So maybe you already always, put your aluminum cans in a bin and not in the trash. Maybe you had always done that. And maybe you had always hiked. But then maybe when you get together with a group of people, perhaps in the Sierra Club chapter, you say, I want to join with other people who are hiking. You join that group and you do the things that members in that group do. You pay your dues, you go on these hiking trips, you go on these camping trips. They bring in speakers to talk about the importance of climate change. And you're learning a lot about some things that you didn't know before. Over time, 6 months or so, then you wake up and you say, I'm an environmentalist. So it happens over time from your engagement, from your involvement in these groups and in these movements. So again, social movements are sites of cultural production, cultural artifacts, and identities. And that's what happened at the birth of what we now know as the environmental justice movement. So these are some images, and these occurrences happened in 1982. Now, my study of this began in 1996. So 82 and 96 weren't too far off. And these images are readily available now, but at the time when I started, they weren't. readily available. But these are some images from that movement. And if you're paying attention, they look like images. They could be images from current movements, right? There's a strong police presence. There are people being arrested. There are people putting their bodies in the way. And these sets of images here, so the story of Warren County, just in brief, at the time, the state of North Carolina had discovered that a contractor who was hired by private industry, by a private company, this contractor was hired to dispose of some PCB waste. And so they got money to gather this waste material from this site in North Carolina. And they were charged with taking it away to be safely disposed of. And the idea was to take it outside of North Carolina to take it to be safely disposed of. And instead of taking it away to be safely disposed of, this contractor decided to dispose of it along the rural roads of North Carolina. No one will know. So if you can imagine like a dump truck with a spigot at the bottom of the truck, and they're just going down the road and the waste is coming out. Well, that's what happened. But they were discovered to have done that. And so the state of North Carolina then had to collect all of this PCB-laden laced soil and then properly dispose of it. So they collected it all. The state of North Carolina now is charged with having to collect it all and properly dispose of it. And there were public hearings across the state to determine where this waste would be disposed of. So some scientists in the division and all decided they had to determine, well, what place was best suited in the state of North Carolina to dispose of this soil, this toxic laden soil. So no one wants this stuff in their backyards. And so, but factors that they considered were, what's the quality of the soil where we will be dumping it? What's the population of the people? Is it densely populated or not? How many people live there? And all of this factored into their decision of where to dispose of it. So there came down to about 10 sites, 10 places across the state where they could dispose of this soil. Warren County was not on the list, by the way, but it got on the list. There were places in the state that were more suitable than Warren County for disposing of the soil, where the soil itself would be more amenable to having this toxic in it and other kinds of factors. But the state ended up choosing Warren County. And they chose Warren County, folks now say, because at the time it was the poorest county in the state. It was a majority of the population were African American, rural and poor. And so this decision was made in Raleigh, right? Warren County, right, is over here, very far away. And when they made the decision to do this, they as they have to do, there was a public announcement, was put in the paper, the local paper in Warren County. But the people who read, who knows what that means? They were part of the decision, right? So it just appeared as an announcement in the paper. When they found out what it was and why did you choose us? Why did you choose this place? There's another story about how the people in Warren County came to find out. So yes, it was put in the local paper, an announcement was. But who read the announcement? There were two people, a couple, a white couple, the Ferocios, is a name. And they came to Warren County from up north. And they resettled there in this lovely, what they thought lovely, idyllic place. Right now, if you go to Warren County, they're billing themselves as this nice tourist attraction place that many towns in North Carolina are doing. But at the time, there wasn't much there. It was very rural. People were still farming and still very poor. But the Ferocios, they saw the announcement and they got alarmed and they started approaching their local officials and were poo-pooed. They started contacting people in North Carolina, at the state legislature and the state agencies, and they were poo-pooed. They were transplants from up north, so they didn't have deep connections to the people in Warren County. But they were trying to generate interest and support. Do you know what's happening here? Do you know what's happening here? So where do you go? Where do you go in the Black community when you want to get people alarmed and involved? Where do you go?
Church.
You go to the church, exactly. So they found their way to the church, Holy Springs Baptist Church. And the Ferocios talked to the pastor. And the pastor was, no, this should not be happening. The Ferocios had said, this is an environmental issue. We can't have this toxic lake soil here. It's an environmental issue. It's an environmental issue. But when the pastor heard the story, and the story about, well, they picked Warren County, an inappropriate place for this. Why did they pick? The pastor's explanation was, it's because we're Black and it's because we're poor. That's why they put it here. So you can now begin to see the connections between the environment and racism, right? These two different streams are now coming together to collide. And that's what happened on this day when the trucks were coming in, because they weren't successful in changing their minds. So on the day that the trucks came in, there was a protest being planned. We're not gonna let them dump it. And so this guy in the middle here, right here, with the collar, does anyone recognize who that is? This was a long time ago. Ben Chapin.
Wow, wow.
The younger Ben Chapin. Ben Chapin, who a dozen years or so ago was the national president of the NAACP. But before then, he's gone through several iterations, but he was one of the Wilmington 10.
Wow.
That's how he got his start as a young man, college student, the Wilmington 10, protesting at a counter and getting arrested, protesting against Jim Crow segregation. Yeah. So he had this background in civil rights, activism and organizing. And he was affiliated with the United Church of Christ, which had a church in Warren County, in Eastern North Carolina. Not in Warren County, but very close. And Ben Chavis happens to be from Warren County. So he has family origins in Warren County. So he learns from family and neighbors and friends and the pastor at Holy Springs about this issue that the Ferocios had brought to the pastor. And so he gets involved, and he is instrumental in helping to get the Black community involved and active and engaged. And so this is the protest that was happening. In the midst of this tussle, if you all have been in a protest lately, some of you have, the tussle between the police and other bystanders and all, people are shouting things, they're saying things out of, they're just can't make sense of why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? There was another woman who worked with Ben Chavis. Her name was Dolly Burwell. Well, Dolly and Ben were friends growing up. So they're out there protesting together and all. And so in the heat of all of the activity, someone's trying to make sense of it. And they say, this is environmental racism. So, I mean, they were trying to make sense of the environmental and the racism, and it wasn't quite like what it was. It was distinct and new, and so they had to come up with something new and distinct to characterize it. And that's where the phrase environmental racism came from, out of the heat. And so if you go back to this notion of the cultural production of social movements, that phrase got produced in the context of people collectively acting together, trying to make sense of their experience. And so what started in Warren County, that spark, it grew. And so how did it grow in a way that it's now an international movement? And I'm going to speed up things because I want to leave some time for folks to, let's discuss this and all. But there are some things that happened in 1991, so it takes time for things to happen. And this kind of thing was happening in Warren County, but it wasn't just happening in Warren County. It was happening in other places all across the country. If you can just imagine businesses and government agencies making decisions about where to put waste, about where to put the chemical factory, about where to put the landfill. These decisions were being made all the time, are being made all the time. And people in local communities were saying no all the time. And it just so happened because of the attention that what was happening in Warren County got, that other communities were beginning to hear, had gotten wind of that happening. If you can imagine with the killing of George Floyd, people are now on the lookout for things like that happening, want to prevent it or want to do something about it. So it's there all the time. This activity has been there all the time, but people are now taking notice of it, and that's what happened in the aftermath of Warren County. People were taking note of these things, and now they had a language that they didn't have before to characterize what was happening. And so in 1991, they decided to come together. They'd been learning about each other through sort of informal networks. And what they wanted to do was to come together in DC, the nation's capital, for all of them to come together and learn about each other. Instead of everybody doing this, let's all get together. So they decided to have what they called an Environmental Justice Leadership Summit in 1991. And when they decided to get together, one of the things that they decided to do is have people from all across the country, and these are communities from all across the country, Native American communities, African American communities, Latino communities, large populations of people in California and New Mexico and Texas, acted in similar ways. All of these different kinds of communities got together under the banner of people of color. That term hasn't always been used, but that was one of the first times that it was used. We are all people of color. And in that, and then not at the same time, but shortly thereafter in 1994, President Bill Clinton issued an executive order 1298 that said that certain concerns needed to be considered in all federal decision-making when it comes to the environment. And so it's called the Environmental Justice Executive Order So this is a timeline of some of the activity. You see the protest in 1983, the People of Color Summit in 1991, and the executive order in 1994. And again, the executive order said that federal actions to ensure environmental justice in minority and low-income populations. And these spots represent the same kinds of activities that were happening in Warren County. These were happening across the South, across the country. These are some of what got produced out of those people coming together in 1991. The principles of environmental justice, 17 of them. I don't expect you to read them all. I just wanted to put a sample there of you to see. One thing on their agenda for the summit was, okay, we're coming together. This is a summit. What are our principles? What do we stand for? So there was some sessions during the conference in which people were sitting in a room and saying, what do we stand for? And it really matters who is in the room when you're making decisions like that. This is the preamble to the principles. And some of the highlighted areas here give you an indication of who was in the room. If they weren't in the room, it wouldn't have got into the document, right? What we hear about the spiritual interdependence of our sacredness of Mother Earth, that came from the Native Americans who were sitting in the room. Their voice is part of this document. So when you're sitting in a room and you're creating something, who is in there that you want to make sure is a part of what you're doing and is a part of a document like this that has the possibility of living on. Right? So this is, again, some of the cultural production that the movement has generated. In North Carolina, now to come back to North Carolina, there's the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, further in the timeline, developed in 1997. So the president's executive order in 1994, 3 years later, there is the Environmental Justice Network. And that formed in 1997. And that came out of, from 1994, when these people from across the country had come together. Some folks who were there from North Carolina said, well, we need to do this in North Carolina. We need all of the groups in North Carolina to come together, because remember when I said I was trying to find them? I couldn't find them. So they said, well, let's try to find them. Let's bring us all together. So they formed a network. And this network is composed of community members and activists, and there's a strong academic presence in the network. So academics from UNC and North Carolina Central and other HBCUs can play a pivotal role in the development of this network, which brings together groups from across the state. And what happens when they come from across the state is they learn from each other. When you bring people together, they're sharing their stories, they're learning. People get invited, people hear, who are impacted community, they hear, they have something happening in their communities, and they hear, and they want to come, and they learn this language, they get access to resources like state agencies, there might be some grants offered by universities, and that's how it grows. That's how this movement has grown. And people learn to reframe what's happening in their communities as environmental justice issues where they would not have it before. And if we were to go back to that original slide with the public housing as climate justice, you can think about it similarly. How did those public housing residents and activists, why is that a climate justice issue? What was that process like of it becoming that? So just some points here that I just mentioned. The movement spreads one community at a time, and the environmental justice movement takes on a kind of local homegrown flavor because it's very much rooted in what's happening in a community. This was the executive order signed by the president. One question I have, and we can have this for discussion, is why didn't environment, to go back to the earlier question, why didn't this happen in the context of the civil rights movement? When this was happening in 83, 82, where was the NAACP? And why are we not hearing about the NAACP and environmental justice and climate justice now? So all that to say that this movement is a parallel movement, and it's developed as a parallel movement to the civil rights movement. These are perhaps some reasons why. This is the environmental justice movement here in the state. These are activists from who make up the staff and the board member. When they first formed, there was no staff. There were no advisory board members. It was very much local people coming together. But over time, from 97 to now, they've become much more formal. And so there's a staff and a budget and things like that. But there's still very much a local homegrown flavor to what they do. This is the NAACP here in North Carolina. Among their issues, you don't see environmental justice. But the movement started here. There's this big EJ network here that engages communities across the state, but it's not an explicit issue of the state chapter. Just coming back to the question, environmental racism has now become associated with climate. Environmental racism has now become environmental justice, which has become associated with climate justice. It's not natural that that happens. It's not inevitable that that happens. And a lot of cultural production happens in the process. And I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, Kim. We have a slight problem with, what that group is, Porch-like.
Porch. Well,
Apparently, EV again double booked. And the manager apparently told these Porch people that she had told us that they were coming today, and that is not true. So they wanted us to clear out. We stood our ground, but we agreed that, can we clear out by 3? Finish by 3.
Yeah, but we don't have refreshments today.
No, we don't have any refreshments. 3 is good, so we will finish by 3, so we still have half an hour for question and answer. It's quite good. So, okay. I'm going to have to go back and forth with the mic because.
So I lived in Buffalo from 1979 to 1983. And one of the things that happened during that time was my husband and I were looking for a mall in Niagara Falls, and we got lost. It was before Google Maps. And we came upon this fenced area, and all of these houses boarded up, completely deserted. It was like going into a sci-fi movie. It was Love Canal. And Love Canal was suburban white, and that area was my undocumented or unresearched impression is that whole area was very segregated. Blacks lived in the cities, and this was white suburbia. But I wonder if there was any interconnection, if the activism started by the Love Canal people at all got involved in this, or if they were completely separate.
Yeah, they were completely separate. They developed completely separate. But if you now look at a timeline about the environmental movement in the country, you'll see Love Canal, you'll see Warren County, and it's being strung together as a story. That's how you do. This happened, and this happens, and this happens, and you bring it all together to try to make it make sense.
And Love Canal was an industrial, that was a corporate malfeasance. They stored this stuff on the grounds of the school, I think. So it wasn't the same picture of people with no power. It was just over chemical.
But imagine too, remember too when we said, these people make connections when they meet and when they hear about it. So maybe they didn't meet each other. Maybe they didn't hear about each other. And maybe they did, but they didn't like connect it to that. It takes a lot of work to make the connection. It seems obvious now, but maybe then not so.
Yes. I just wanted to say that I'm proud to say that one of the first movements I got involved in here in North Carolina was the effort to fight for the fight against the landfill there in Warrenton. We had just moved to Pittsburgh, and I got involved with some local people there to fight that. And I think I did it more as an environmental issue as opposed to a justice issue. But I'm glad the two have joined together. So this has been a great talk to hear about. Thank you.
I was sort of interested to hear about the Native American connection because to me, and I lived in Texas, Amarillo, that part of the coast for a while, certainly was close to New Mexico. Native American activism here would be different because Native Americans are for the most part living on land that is federal, it's federal land. Whereas if you're in the West, then it's American Indian land and the federal laws that apply. And I think there's a real schism in that community about what they want for that and what they're willing to sell rights for and compromise EPA laws. I'm kind of interested as to how somebody from North Carolina who's living in Cherokee would feel as opposed to somebody in New Mexico who's on a reservation with uranium tailing problems.
It's great to wonder, right? Because it's not natural or inevitable that they would. The Cherokee here, the Native American community in North Carolina, is not very much connected to the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. The national EJ network has communities, Native American communities from across the country. It's interesting that, it's an interesting question, why not the Native American communities in here, in North Carolina are engaged in them? Maybe they're not being impacted in some of these kinds of ways. That would make sense for them to choose to connect to the environmental justice movement.
Great talk. I lived in Holly Springs in North Carolina here in the mid-early 90s, and the same issue was happening there, mostly African American, fairly not well-to-do kind of community, and ended up being basically the site for the Wake County garbage dump. And what happened after that was a whole bunch of white people moved there. And they became very upset about it. So the issue just seems to never die, because this happened, a lot of it is, after some of these events that you were describing, including the executive order. Do you see improvement over time, is my question.
That's an interesting question, because it could be that these occurrences are happening all over and people are just, as they become aware of it, it may seem like it's happening more than it had been, or that it's not dying down. but maybe people are just becoming more aware and light's being shed on it. There are studies that document some of the disproportionate impact of particular kinds of sightings of industry, and to look at, has that changed over time? Has the location of municipal and county landfills in particular communities, has the numbers of occurrences or the percentage of occurrences changed over time? That would be an interesting study to do. I would probably say, but.
Several years ago, perhaps, but it's not 15, there was a company associated with roads. I don't know, there's tar making or whatever that was trying to be established in Eastern Durham. And there was a big protest and work against it. And they finally defeated that. The people I knew who were associated with it saw it in terms of environmental racism, but they were, I just wondered if the North Carolina environmental justice was associated or involved in that.
How did the community members characterize what was happening to them?
I don't know exactly. I mean, the person I knew who was most involved in it characterized it as, you know, they were trying to plunk a toxic industry in the poor African American side of town. But I can't remember the African American involvement itself.
Right. And so it would be hard for white people to say this is environmental racism in the absence of Black people also saying it, right? So I wonder if that group, members of that group, somehow learned about this community over here or that community over there and found their way to the environmental justice summit that happens every year, where if they'd gone, they would have gotten connected with a whole bunch of other people, and then perhaps started talking about what's happening to them in a particular way, access to resources and networks that they could then bring back, support their local struggle. So all that to say that it could happen, but it's not inevitable that it would happen. And what ended up happening in the Durham case would be interesting, because it could be that maybe some folks started talking about it as an environmental racism issue, but it didn't gain traction. And it could have gained traction if other things had happened to support its development. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I'll go back and check with my friend and see what.
Yeah.
I have more, this is a tough subject for me. I have more than 80 years experience in such things, walking in both worlds. I'm from American Indian community and on reservations with a lot of elders. And for all those years, American Indians really never had a voice about any environmental issues. Several, nobody really cared because it was not a strong influence. And also it had to do with language. When our elders would say, "You're poisoning our mother," it's considered like mythological, instead of understanding that's the way people talked about it. When there was no written language, that's what people said in the English terms, and it wasn't until the African American community, as you are describing, named it that it became a thing. Environmental racism, environmental justice, environmental injustices. Something has to have a name to become a thing.
Otherwise, because it's been going on all the time. Remember Robert Kennedy Jr. and river keepers and talking about it's only poisoned near African American communities and so on. But before it became a thing, it was happening, but it wasn't described in a term that anybody recognized nationally. And it wasn't until African American community coined the term, it's a thing, it's something, it's real. And the activism in understanding that now we can join and make a larger community, a larger voice, that any of this traditional ecological knowledge, which is actually a term I coined about 40 years ago. I'm an environmental scientist. That coupling with and partnering with the African American community was the only time that it began that actually American Indians had a voice and we shared the common voice, but there was never any attention paid to it or didn't matter. So naming the term, calling it something so that it's a thing, and then partnering with like-minded people, like-minded groups who do bring attention is the only way these days too on any issue. You really have to do that, but it's been just totally amazing and wonderful. So I thank you for all of your efforts in it too. It's happening. Thank you.
You said it beautifully. There's nothing to say.
It's almost a same old story that industry is only being located in minority districts. And industry will say we're there because property values are lower or other placement factors, or maybe they cause the property values to go down. So that's where you sort of chicken and an egg. But then you end up with basically an economic segregation. So how is this? So what's the solution to that? See, that's how will that ever be solved?
You tell me. Well, I would say that struggles are ongoing, right? Economic struggles are ongoing, racial struggles are ongoing, struggles for justice are ongoing. And at different moments in time, they take a different flavor depending on who's in the room and who's naming what. And who knew that a public housing issue would be climate justice? What is that? But they're all the time, but needing a name. And with the name comes a whole new world that you can access for resources and people and money and all the things that are needed to keep a movement going. And it takes a lot of work, cultural work, people making sense, people coming out, people writing their legends. It just takes a lot, and you don't know how it's going to end up. You didn't know that it's going to become a movement. You don't know, but you keep acting, you keep doing. It's like a relay race. The baton is given to you. You just do your part in the race. And who knows if you're going to win or not. But you do your part. If you don't do your part, well, that's it.
Probably can do without the microphone.
No, please. I was surprised to see climate connected with the environmental justice. Could you tell me what climate justice is and how it's related to your environmental justice and environmental racist movements?
I love that question because on the face of it, right, it doesn't have anything to do with the other thing, except when you look at a place like New Orleans and the floods and who's impacted, and all, then you say, oh, I see. It makes some kind of sense. But you gotta do the work of thinking about it. Somebody had to do the work and has done the work to link environmental racism with climate action, with climate change, which is now called climate justice. Right? And maybe that's where the connection is with that word justice. It brings in this whole nother dimension than just climate change. Climate justice says, well, somebody's been impacted. Climate change, the weather changed.
The company that you've dumped polychlorinated phenols on North Carolina roads, are they in jail? Seeking of justice.
I don't think they went to jail.
No, so they just signed something that they
Paid a
pay a
fine.
fine and then they don't admit any wrongdoing, like it's usual how the companies do. Another question I have is what has recent progress been on the problem we have here in North Carolina of hog farms and spraying the content of the lagoons on fields and ruining people's environment? And what's recent progress in that area?
I can't tell you about the recent progress or likely lack thereof, but some of those communities that have been impacted by hog farming in Tillery, North Carolina, in Dublin, and Tar Heel, they are part of the North Carolina EJ network. And so where that thing was happening, lagoons and neighborhoods, the smell, they were happening. And then some of those folks in Dublin heard about the same kind of thing that was happening in Tillery. And they were invited to come to the Environmental Justice Network Summit. And they got access to all this language and resources. And they have become part of, the folks in Dublin have become part of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. And I don't know the success of the people in Dublin because it's scary for me to go to Dublin, actually. Some of the folks in Dublin who are part of the EJ network that we talked to, some of them have shared stories about how they've been intimidated and scared by the powers that be to try to silence them, to try to steal their land. Folks walking in their house, uninvited, just coming in their house and sitting at the table with their grandmother, talking to her. I mean, this is still North Carolina, and there is still racial intimidation. And who owns Smithfield? Who's sitting in the North Carolina State Legislature who owns Smithfield? Who has a vested interest in the hog industry ruling the world? I can't tell you what recent progress there has been or not, but I do know that people are continuing to organize in defense of their health and their communities and their land. Thanks for the question.
Maura, did you have a question?
Just a small comment, yeah.
First of all, I just wanted to say that was an awesome talk. You did not have to worry about us falling asleep. But I only heard part of this story because I often listen to NPR in the car. So then if I leave the car, I don't hear the whole story and it's the beginning or the end. But part of this particular story was an older lady from Watts neighborhood of LA talking about, and Stan actually made me think about it when he was discussing the idea of the climate justice, because they were talking about tree canopies and how much percentage of land had proper tree canopies in Watts compared to, say, Beverly Hills. And of course, the numbers are highly disparate. And so this woman, one of the things she's trying to get lots of more people to do is plant trees. Because as things get hotter and hotter, having trees around drops your temperature tremendously. And again, this is an area of climate justice because a lot of these poor areas have a lot more concrete, a lot fewer trees. And it was mostly just a comment on that.
I'm just gonna speak from here. The Andy just did a story on that, and there too, stamp cars for Durham, a neighborhood in Durham, and sort of the outer, richer, and it was just exactly that.
I was going to say the same thing.
Oh.
Thank you, Jane.
Talking about farms ruling the world, and Animal Farm said that already.
I'll end on this just to say that what you all are saying, now climate justice makes sense, right? Streets didn't have canopies before. Yeah. But now, because there's a language that people can use that will bring them NPR attention, right? Yeah, great.
We have time for one more question. Does anybody have?
I was just curious about what work has been done to see how social media has accelerated this movement, because I imagine that this, as it's connected to everything, we think of capitalism and the invisible forces that run our lives. This is part of that, and I imagine that social media is pushing us to the forefront a little bit more than maybe was in the past. And so, is there work being done to kind of track how people are now meeting and connecting in a different way, not necessarily in person, but in these online spaces to bring attention to these issues and make policy change?
Are you in grad school?
No, but thank you for thinking about
So that's a question for the academy, right? To see kind of social media's impact on social movements. And we just had the last 2 years as great evidence for how it came. We were all in lockdown, but the Black Lives Matter movement is one of the world's largest social movements because of social media. So yeah, there's a role.
Right. I've closed the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a comment on the whole talk about climate. In my lab, I had to install a carbon dioxide monitor because we use liquid carbon dioxide to chill one of our instruments. And what I noticed was the baseline of carbon monoxide in the lab was around 460 ppm, which is quite a bit above the Hansen limit. Hansen said that above 400, the global warming is not going to be reversed. So I had my people go outside, take the monitor and go outside. And it was still around, not as 460, but it was around 430. So carbon dioxide, so those of you who have carbon dioxide monitors in your home, you should pay attention, because that carbon dioxide, especially in your home or in a closed environment, can go up. Especially if you're in a meeting and a lot of people generating hot air. All right, then if you have any quick announcements.
Oh, they're out here.
Oh, they're out there.
Right out in front there.
Come on, here, just get
For
us.
no reason. Panicking for no reason.
One of the things I want to mention is that AEU is looking for volunteers to work the next year's assembly. So if you are interested, please go on the AEU website. And as Caroline Parker said, she has been managing this whole thing for the past I don't know how many years. she said that it's a wonderful experience, and it's an acting experience, but nevertheless, it is a paid person. So we do need volunteers to help out with arranging next year's assembly. Yes, you want to?
Can I take a couple of minutes? We didn't have the last couple of happy hours, but Wednesday should be a Pittsburgh happy hour. Are we gonna do it?
Yeah, I guess we could, we can sit outside at the town.
Okay.
Where is it? Is the mall?
Actually, or we can do there too, either way, but, there are outdoor tables at the lawn. So
Because of
I'll
the-
see if we can do it out there.
Because of the pit, there are too many smokers outside.
Well, they're out beyond the patio now. They set up an outside the patio.
Okay, well, that helps.
But I'll check with the bond. There are tables out there, though they're not ones that you necessarily put together.
Yeah, we can always put tables. Even
Okay,
if
so
they're round
happy
tables.
hour, Pittsburgh, Wednesday, 6.
All right.
The other thing I just wanted to mention, I think all of the board is here. Could we have a 10-minute meeting just to talk about this issue with EV and make sure we don't do anything?
Where?
Sorry?
Where you want to be?
Right back there
Okay.
in one of the rooms. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right, but, okay,
We'll keep it short.
all right, our program has ended, but our but our community continues to hold true to the ethical culture. Please join